Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Stop Talking Shit podcast. What do we have on today, man?
Today we have one of our favourite, or one of my, look, I can't speak for you, but it is one of my favourites. It's one of my favourite humans.
Definitely one of mine too, yeah.
We have Rebecca Edwards on today, and just for a bit of background about how we know Rebecca, I met her at uni. Did you meet her at uni as well?
Yeah, you did. She told me.
You did, and it was kind of like love at first sight, really. And the friendship has just continued to develop over time in just this beautiful way, just blossom like a lovely flower. And then I found myself back in Rebecca's wing when she started working in the field of probiotics, which has been really exciting. And we're so excited to sort of tell our listeners a little bit more about what you do and explore the whole realm of probiotics today. So would you like to introduce yourself, Rebecca?
Oh, well, thank you, you sweetheart. So, as you said, I'm Rebecca Edwards. I was previously your lecturer, both of you lovely little flowers, at Endeavour College. And I'm a qualified naturopath. I'm an educator, speaker, writer. I'm just someone who likes to talk a lot, essentially. And that's taken me through, my career in natural medicine, standing in front of people, talking a lot. So I've been a lecturer for almost 20 years. And then for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been the Director of Education at Biome Australia, which a lot of your listeners may know as the company behind Activated Probiotics, a range of practitioner-only, strain-specific, evidence-based probiotics. And that gives me lots of opportunities for doing my favorite thing in the world, talking.
Amazing. Yeah, we love a good chat as well. I mean, that's why we started this podcast, because it just gives us an opportunity to just talk and talk and talk for days. There's people that love to listen, apparently, so that's good.
A match made in heaven. Yeah.
I think so. So
it's more for us than the listeners.
pretty much. But yeah, so basically Rebecca's an expert in probiotics is what she's trying to say in a nutshell. And, we kind of live in this society now where products are everywhere and marketing is, really excessive in terms of, which products or which supplements we need to improve our lifestyle and which probiotics are going to be best for us. And I know for myself, with a history of working in health food and retail, there really is a lot of probiotics and a lot of products sort of on the market, and you've got your shelf stable in your fridge and, you're really high strength, and everything's all a little bit of hype sometimes in terms of, probiotics and the cost as well. Some probiotics can be really expensive, and sometimes people conflate cost or popularity with, quality and what's being better. But just to give our listeners an explanation about what probiotics are and a brief intro about how they work before we get into all the nitty-gritties in terms of the myths and things like that would be amazing.
Sure thing. Well, probiotics are live microorganisms which, when given in adequate doses, confer a defined health benefit to the host. So that's the official definition as defined by the World Health Organization. There's a lot of confusion at kind of community level about what probiotics are. And I think a lot of that comes from the blurring of the lines between the idea of fermented foods and then strain-specific probiotic supplements. And they're actually two different things. Fermented foods are, foods which have had microorganisms deliberately introduced to them, things like yogurt or even cheeses, things like kefir, things like kombucha and sauerkraut, and a million other things. There's fermented foods in every traditional diet around the world. And fermented foods have historically played a part in providing the human body with products of fermentation and occasionally with, the odd live microorganism, but there's a reason they're not the same thing as probiotic supplements. For a supplement or a substance to be considered truly probiotic, we need to know the exact microorganism which is present in that product. We need to know exactly how many units of that live microorganism are present in one dose. And we also need to know what happens to the human body when you take in that dose of that specific microorganism. So if someone's buying, say, yogurt in the supermarket, they are not going to know which exact microbes are present, although some food manufacturers are starting to put that information on labeling, but they're not going to know exactly how many units of that microbe they're taking in with each mouthful or dose. And they also may not know any particular benefits associated with that microbe. And coming back to it, really more than anything, fermented foods, it's right there in the name, they're fermented. They are foods which contain the products of fermentation rather than the actual agents of fermentation, the bacteria themselves. So when you're eating a tub of yogurt, for example, what you're eating are the metabolites which have been produced when that particular species of bacteria has been introduced to milk. And you can tell because, yogurt tastes kind of tangy or sometimes feels a little bit bubbly in your mouth. And that's telling you that it's got lots of things like lactic acids and other, metabolites of bacterial fermentation, whereas a probiotic supplement contains the live microorganisms themselves. We know exactly what they are. We know their genus, their species, their strain. We know exactly how many are in each capsule. And we also know what happens to a particular human population when they are given that exact microbe at that exact dose. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question of what probiotics are.
Yeah, no, but you answered so many questions there, including like a bunch of different myths as well about, what probiotics are and how they actually work. And it's interesting because, in conversation, a lot of people will say, oh, I'm just going to have yogurt, fermented foods, and that's going to confer the same benefit. But as you can tell, there's a really big difference between what you get in fermented foods versus a specific strain and doing it, acting in a specific way in our body.
There are some people that, what would you say to some people who just want to take probiotics for general health? So they think, oh, I'll just take whatever off the counter and just for my general everyday well-being. Is that something that probiotics is designed for?
That's such a great question because for a lot of people, they associate the whole concept of probiotics with that kind of really general, fairly meaningless term of gut health. And we really want to dive into what exactly someone means when they say gut health or even general health. So I guess my first question for someone who says, can I take probiotics for general health would be, well, what do you mean by general health? What is the action that you're wanting a probiotic to take? And then the next step is to find out, well, which strains have been shown to perform that action and which strains will then give you the outcome you're looking for. Another way of kind of thinking about it is you can swap that word probiotics for another really kind of broad umbrella term like medication. And can you imagine if a patient said to, a pharmacist or their GP, well, I'm thinking about taking some medication for my general health. Is that a good idea? Should I just go into the pharmacy and pick up any medication? And we need to think about probiotics in the same kind of way that, that umbrella term probiotics encompasses hundreds of different individual strains, all of which act as their own intervention. So as we wouldn't say to a patient, you've got high blood pressure, you need medicine, you've got headaches, you need medicine. We wouldn't say to someone, or you've got, I don't know, chronic diarrhea, you need probiotics. You've got chronic thrush, you need probiotics. We would talk about the specific strains of probiotic that person needed. So I'm very sure that there are probiotics which would be beneficial for someone just looking for general health, but would need to know what that term general health meant and what outcome that person would be looking to see.
Yeah, I think they think of it as like a multivitamin. So the same way people have in their regime just a general multivitamin, like this is going to keep me healthy or this is going to stop me from getting sick. I think a lot of people have that perception that I'm going to take a probiotic as well for the same idea, for the same purpose. So yeah,
really interesting because that kind of I think you're absolutely right. I hear that as well, and I feel that kind of leads us towards discussing a huge misunderstanding about what probiotics are actually doing. I mean, if we think about the concept of a multivitamin, what we're essentially doing when we take a multivitamin is filling gaps that might not be filled by our diet. So people might think, well, I've eaten junk food for the last few days. Let me take a multivitamin tablet, which is going to top up all of those nutrients found in the fresh fruit and vegetables and things that I should be eating. But probiotics are not working like that. We don't have kind of, an RDI for a daily intake of probiotics. We don't have a particular, nutritional need. But also when we are taking a probiotic supplement, it's not adding to our own microbiome. It's not becoming part of the bacteria which normally live inside us. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions about probiotics out there, because you will still hear people say things like, take a probiotic to feed your microbiome or to rebuild your gut bacteria, etc. And that's actually not what they're doing.
Or if they're trying to sound really sciencey, they'll say, take this probiotic to re-inoculate the guts. And that one's just my favorite. I just love it.
Well,
It sounds so smart, but it's not that smart at all.
That's right. It doesn't matter how many syllables you use. That whole concept is still a bit of a myth.
That's such a good answer.
Yeah.
I think that was really good for our listeners to hear that.
100%.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if we could expand on that, Rebecca, if probiotics are not magically deciding
re-inoculating,
re-inoculating, what are they doing then? So how, just for our listeners to fully understand, how do they work? So when I pop a pill, when I take a probiotic pill, what can I expect to sort of happen as that travels through my digestive tract?
Well, you've kind of got the major concept right there. It travels through your digestive tract. When you take a probiotic supplement, a lot of people are kind of fairly intrigued to find out that probiotics are with you for a short period of time. They're not here for a long time. They're here for a good time. They are just basically taking a tour of your digestive tract from the mouth downwards and literally ending up in the toilet. They're not hanging around for a long period of time. Probiotic supplements are what we call transiently colonizing. So they might hang around for a few days. A couple of strains have been found to hang around a little bit longer than that, but they really are just passing through. So if they're just passing through, what are they actually doing? That's a really good question. I suppose the most broad way of answering that is that they're interacting with your local intestinal environment. They're interacting with your immune system, and they're modulating the activity of those immune cells. The way I kind of like to describe it, to practitioners especially, is to say that probiotics are helping to bring the body back more towards homeostasis. So they're really modulatory in action. And essentially, when they are traveling through the digestive tract, they're live bacteria, right? As we know, every living organism on Earth needs to metabolize. So it has particular functions that it needs to perform. Like a human being as a living organism needs to eat and drink. And, there are byproducts produced when we eat something, things like, different metabolic byproducts, or on the most kind of crude level, things like poo and wee are byproducts of our metabolic processes. When bacteria are living, they're also eating, except that we call it fermenting. So supplemental probiotics that we take, when we swallow them, they go into our digestive tract, and being live microorganisms, they're looking for their next meal. And the meal that they're going to consume is whatever you've got hanging around in your digestive tract. So they essentially eat what you eat. They eat largely fibers and other undigestible substances from our own food, but they can also consume things. They can, as we like to put it, ferment on substrates coming from the mucus that we produce in our digestive tract, for example. And as they ferment on these substrates or consume these fuel sources, they will also produce byproducts, which we call metabolites. And these metabolites will then have a, sometimes powerful action on our intestinal environment or through communication with our immune cells. And then the probiotic bacteria themselves just continue on through the digestive tract and end up passing out of the body. But they have essentially left a message or an impact on our body as they've been traveling through.
So to surmise, they're only useful while you're taking them, pretty much.
That's a really great question. But because they are modulatory in action, so they are essentially modifying what's going on, they actually have lasting benefits. So this is why I think research is so important. And I know, Iman, I know that you agree with me on this. You're a big research nerd as well. And this is where we can really see what happens to people when they take specific strains of probiotics, and we can follow the outcomes even after they've stopped taking them. So what I love to see in a clinical trial is, we all know that a good quality clinical trial is randomized, placebo-controlled, and double-blind, so that people taking the product have no idea if they're taking a probiotic or a placebo, which looks and tastes and seems to be exactly the same. And we can then trace what happens and compare the two groups. What happens, let's say we've got a probiotic for asthma. What happens in half the people taking the probiotic compared to half the people taking the placebo. But an extra useful part of a clinical trial is when researchers also have what we call a washout period, which is when the trial participants finish taking the probiotic or the placebo, but the researchers keep watching what happens. And in the case of asthma, for example, and I'm actually talking in reference to a particular clinical trial here, which was done on probiotics in a large population of children with asthma. They took the product every day for 16 weeks, but then the researchers kept following them for another 12 weeks after they'd finished taking the product. And what they found was that there remained a really significant difference in the number of asthma attacks and asthma exacerbations between the two groups. So we know that probiotics can continue to exert a really powerful impact for quite a long time after you finish taking them. And that's because they do work not just at the time you're taking them, but because they have essentially modified pathways of communication in the gut and in the immune system, they actually leave you in a better state than when you started taking them.
Sure.
It doesn't matter how often I hear this information. Every time I hear it, I'm just like, wow, it's mind blown. And how important is it, Rebecca, to have these clinical trials and to have access to this sort of research? Because I think there's still a lot of blurred lines in terms of the general public, in terms of, where research is going with probiotics and, where, in terms of that strain specificity that we're going to talk about shortly as well. But where do you think research is at now, and where do you think research will continue to go with probiotics at the moment?
Well, I think we're at a point where there is now growing recognition that the microbiome influences every body process, every organ, every system, every disease state. And so research is really now starting to turn to how can we manipulate or work with the microbiome in order to bring about positive impacts in lots of different body processes and health conditions. There is certainly more of an interest in research into strain-specific probiotics. I think, as we've spoken about already in this podcast, we've really kind of moved on the idea that probiotics are just for gut health. And we're now really understanding that probiotics can have a powerful impact on other body parts and other conditions. And I'm looking at some really interesting research that's coming out at the moment, or coming out soon, on things like the power of specific probiotics in cardiovascular health, looking at the impact probiotics can have on lipid balance in the body, on cardiovascular risk. And that's something that even a few years ago, nobody would have thought would be related to probiotics in any way. So I think we're going to see some surprises over the next few years in understanding what probiotics can actually do.
Yeah, I did my honours in inflammatory bowel disease and the effect on the gut microbiome with medication. So that was very interesting to, I got to really dive into the gut microbiome and how it impacts the body and how it impacts, the inflammatory pathways and whatnot. And so correcting the gut microbiome essentially has a sort of ongoing effect where the inflammation reduces the inflammation and starts to the body starts to heal. So it was a really good year. Intense
Yeah,
year.
absolutely. And how amazing would it be if, if this information was more widely understood and accepted? And I think that hopefully that's what we're going to see in the next few years. And to go back to the first part of your question there, Iman, why is research important, or is research important? It's important because we need to have the evidence to back up everything we're talking about. As practitioners, it's really important for us to have access to evidence-based interventions, because this is how we have confidence in treating our patients. This is how we know what's going to work. And for, the general public and for consumers and patients, I think that having, again, access to evidence-based products is so important, because I'm a big believer in empowerment when it comes to healthcare. And if you have access to information about the interventions and supplements available to you, you can make the most informed choice.
Yeah, it's so true. And I find that because I work with allergies a lot, Rebecca, and we'll talk about different strains and sort of delve into allergies a little bit more soon. But I find that clients really do love to know what research is out there, and they do really appreciate that kind of backstory around how probiotics could help, and understanding why the benefits there. And I've also seen clinically that even when they do finish taking a probiotic for, say, 12 to 16 weeks, that they do continue to see benefits. And even if they're taking them sporadically after that, say a couple of times a week, those benefits are still there. So there's a lot of proof in terms of what I see clinically in terms of seeing those impacts on the microbiome long term, even from that short period of use, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, informed. If they're more informed, they're more likely to stick to the regime. So the more they know that how it works and how it's going to impact their lives, the more clients are going to stick to that.
Yeah, and I think it's a good time to mention safety here. Probiotics are often such a great option as far as an intervention goes, because they're practically safe for everyone, correct, Rebecca?
They definitely have a really low risk profile, is how I would describe it. And a lot of that comes back to, again, how probiotics are actually working. So, some of the biggest risks when it comes to supplements is, the biggest risk really is interactions between natural supplements and pharmaceutical medications. And a lot of people feel that when they're taking a natural supplement, that because it's natural, it's essentially going to be harmless as well. And, that's true a lot of the time. But one of the biggest issues can be that, any substance you take that enters the bloodstream needs to go through the liver. And when substances go through the liver, there is the propensity for liver enzyme activity to be altered. And this could have anything like up to a disastrous effect when it comes to altering the speed at which medications are metabolized. A great example here would be the herb St. John's wort, or hypericum, which can alter the production of liver enzymes, resulting in medications being processed really quickly through the liver, and essentially leading to drug overdoses, because taking a particular medication in combination with St. John's wort will see an increase in the amount of that drug in the bloodstream. And for some medications, that can be really, really dangerous. The thing about probiotics is they're not ever in the bloodstream, because, like we were speaking about a little while ago, they stay in the digestive tract, and they just keep on traveling through the digestive tract and then make their way, out of the body via the toilet. And because they're not crossing into the bloodstream, they're not going into the liver. And because they're not going into the liver, there is no risk to the metabolism of medications. So that's one of the biggest risks associated with taking any supplement or medication, is the impact it could have on other substances. And that's just not an issue with probiotics. There's also not the same risk as there is with other substances when it comes to toxicity, or overdose even. And again, that's because we're not actually absorbing probiotics. In some parts of the world, probiotics are actually classified as medical devices rather than supplements, because they're not ever considered to be absorbed by the body. They're considered to stay on the surface. And if you really think about it, the lining of the digestive tract technically is the surface of the body, because, if a substance is not being absorbed across that digestive lining into the bloodstream, it's not actually becoming part of you. And probiotics are not being absorbed, so they're not becoming part of us. And that's where a lot of the risk comes from. So they are a really low risk intervention.
And that's why the reason you can have antibiotics and probiotics, because one enters the portal, it gets absorbed through the bloodstream, the other one is straight through the gut.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another big question that we get a lot in the world of probiotic education is, can you take probiotics and antibiotics at the same time? And if you can, how far apart do you need to separate them? And the answers to that is that you absolutely can and should take probiotics and antibiotics at the same time, and you don't need to separate them for exactly what you just said, Mariam. They're going to different places. The whole purpose of taking antibiotics is to get the antibacterial substance into the bloodstream as fast as possible, so that it can then be carried around to fight infection wherever it may be in the body. Whereas with probiotics, of course, they're never going into the bloodstream. They're staying in the digestive tract. And their job when you're taking antibiotics is to reduce there are several things going on when you're taking probiotics with antibiotics. The first thing is that probiotics are going to help reduce the risk of antibiotic side effects. So they're going to help reduce the likelihood of someone experiencing antibiotic-associated diarrhea or thrush, whether that's oral thrush or vaginal thrush. The presence of particular strains of probiotics can be helpful in reducing that risk. But there are other reasons to take probiotics with antibiotics too. And one of them, which I know that you're both really passionate about public health. One of them is a really important public health issue, which is, really doing everything we can to reduce the risk of, essentially running out of effective antibiotics, antibiotic resistance. When we take strains of probiotics, which have that immunomodulatory benefit, we're essentially working with our patient's immune response. We are hopefully making the need for future antibiotic prescriptions less likely to occur. We're all kind of doing our bit when it comes to reducing antibiotic resistance.
Right.
Good stuff.
Is there any so when we're usually probiotics are in two forms, so in a capsule and in powder, is it better to take it in powder form? Is there any destruction that occurs that goes through the GI system, or is it capsulated for a reason so that it doesn't get damaged by the time it reaches the gut? Then they can sort of dissolve and disperse. So what is better?
It's a great question. And, you're really getting to the heart of a really important issue there, which is essentially coming back to the idea that stomach acid is antibacterial, and this is something that, when I used to teach anatomy and physiology of the digestive tract, which I love teaching, and I'm glad that I still get to do that, that's a really important concept that we spend a lot of time educating on, that stomach acid is not just there to break down proteins, it's there as part of your immune system. Your stomach acid is essentially one of the first barriers that substances coming from the outside world encounter when they enter your body. So stomach acid is like this enormous defense system, and it is inherently antibacterial as it degrades proteins. That includes bacterial proteins. So it's been a challenge for a long time in the world of probiotic research and production. How do we get live bacteria past the antibacterial stomach acid? And in the world of kind of more pharmaceutical medication, there's the whole concept of enteric coating. Now, that's not exactly what we're doing with probiotics. You were asking Mariam about, is powder or capsule better? Doesn't actually make a difference when it comes to passing the stomach acid. Capsules that are, holding probiotic powder together are generally just cellulose capsules. So they're just fiber essentially, and they dissolve in water very, very quickly. So taking a probiotic in a capsule won't make any difference to its exposure to your antibacterial stomach acid. But what does make a difference, there are a couple of things that do. One is, taking strains which have been shown to be more acid resistant. And this is the case with, one of the products I work with, Biome Her, which is a vaginal probiotic. Now, you two will be very aware, and I'm sure your listeners may be as well, that the vaginal environment is quite acidic, and that's part of the vagina's immune defense. It's an organ which maintains a particular acidity to repel the growth of pathogens. That means that strains which can grow in the vagina are naturally fairly acid resistant strains. So when you're swallowing probiotic strains which have been associated with positive vaginal outcomes, we know that they're going to be a little bit more capable of dealing with surviving stomach acid. But something that has really helped to solve the problem of getting live bacteria through that antibacterial stomach acid environment is microencapsulation. And this is where a thin coating of food-grade plant-derived lipid is applied to the actual bacterial cells. And this means that they essentially have a protective layer separating them from that antibacterial stomach acid. Lipids or fats are not metabolized by stomach acid at all. They're not broken down until they reach the next part of the digestive system, the small intestine, where they're then acted on by bile and pancreatic lipase and brush border enzymes. All of these substances don't come into play until you're actually in the intestinal tract. So by using a lipid coating around the bacteria, this is protecting them from stomach acid. And this coating is on the actual bacteria. It's not on the capsule. So the capsule doesn't actually make a difference. The capsule is just a way to hold the powder together. If people want to open the capsule and sprinkle the powder into food or drink or, anything they like that, that's fine.
So is that standard? Is that standard practice, or is that only particular companies that do that?
I would always advise anyone to discuss that with the company that they're looking at purchasing probiotics from. It's something that at Activated Probiotics that we use a particular trademarked microencapsulation that has been through multiple clinical trials because, being research geeks, we love clinical trials and love to make sure that what we're working with does have good quality evidence behind it. But, I've always been a big believer in both practitioners and consumers having an open dialogue with the companies they're accessing their interventions from and finding out what's going on there.
Yeah. I appreciate your transparency, Rebecca, and I think some listeners might be curious, while we're talking about research and clinical trials, about different companies and how it all works. So I just want to, have a bit of a disclaimer, or I guess have you just explain that briefly to our customers in terms of how some of these clinical trials might work with a company. I know this can vary across different companies, and I know some people might have concerns about this sort of thing. So is there a little bit of background you can give there in terms of how Biome Australia is involved in clinical trials?
Yeah, absolutely. And, thank you for giving the opportunity there. I know that you're also a fellow research geek, and that was also a subject that I used to teach when I was a lecturer, was kind of research methodology and how we can equip practitioners with skills to kind of begin to wade through the complex, sometimes murky world of medical research and how to work out where research stands up and where it doesn't. And one of the things that I would always advise students to look for is, sources of funding when it comes to clinical trials. Who's paying for clinical trials? Who's arranging them? Who's performing them? And this is something that becomes really interesting now that I'm essentially on the other side and working in microbiome research to a degree, I guess, is looking at the importance of maintaining independence of clinical trials. So, the company I work with really loves to support clinical trials, but there is that really important understanding that clinical trials cannot be conducted by companies who are producing products. That's really not ethical. A lot of the time, there may be some initial research conducted by companies who produce products to almost kind of run a small pilot to understand the concept, make a foundational research, but it's really important that clinical trials are conducted by well-regarded independent research institutions or, university departments. So when I talk about the clinical trials that Activated Probiotics is involved in, it's something that I always make clear that we have relationships with researchers at universities, but the actual clinical trials are absolutely conducted by those researchers with zero input from the company about what's being studied and how. Essentially, we, talk to them about the products, and then it's all over to them, and that's where the influence stops. So that's something that I always really want to kind of highlight to, to practitioners as well, that clinical trials are super, super important, but always make sure that they are being conducted independently.
Yeah, such an important piece of information. And I think it's so good to encourage people to ask these sorts of questions and to look into these practices, especially in this world that we're in with so much heavy marketing around probiotics and supplements in general. And I think there is starting to become that sort of, people are sort of asking some of these questions as well, in terms of, everyone's talking about big pharma all the time and, big dairy, and they're funding all these trials. But what about, all these health products? Yeah, big wellness, exactly.
Yeah.
I think our industries are not, safe or exempt from this sort of
criticism.
When it comes to research. So. But I remember actually, Rebecca, the first time I attended a workshop with you, and we were talking about probiotic research, and I think you guys were doing a trial with Latrobe at the time. It might have been Biome Sleep. Oh, no, did I make up that name?
Biome Lift.
Biome Lift. Yeah, I just made it up. Yeah. And I remember asking you, and you were like, yeah, we've got absolutely nothing. We don't even know, we've got nothing to do with that. So we talk to them about the products, and then they do everything. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. That's really good.
Yeah, it is really important. And of course, the universities have to be guided by their own ethics committees as well. So, for example, just going back to that trial, that Biome Lift trial, that trial, when we first started a conversation with the team at Latrobe University, the idea was to set up a trial looking at Biome Lift in people with diagnosed depression. But that concept didn't pass ethics approval because it was not considered ethical for people who had diagnosed depression to have the standard best treatment denied. So people who were considered to have depression, the standard treatment would be antidepressant therapy, and it was not considered ethical to withhold that treatment in order to examine the impact of Biome Lift. So the clinical trial that was completed on Biome Lift was done in a population of subthreshold depression. So these were people who essentially met the criteria to be considered to have subthreshold depression. In other words, they had symptoms of depression, but were not severe enough to warrant medication. And that was what that university's ethics committee decided was ethical in the construction of that particular clinical trial. And obviously that's nothing whatsoever to do with, activated probiotics. That's a conversation between the research team at that university and their ethics committee. And that, the clinical trial that came out of that is amazing, fascinating, and incredibly valuable. But it was not in any way guided or shaped by any of us at Activated Probiotics.
Yeah, it's really good information for everybody to know. I think, and hoping that podcasts like ours reshape the way people see this kind of information, see wellness, the wellness industry, see research. I mean, that's the goal for me anyway. But
yeah,
it's good information for people to know.
So I think everyone's got a pretty good understanding now about, what probiotics are in terms of how some of these studies work, and where we're kind of at in terms of probiotic research, which is awesome. I'd love to take a bit more of a deep dive into some of those myths about probiotics. We've already discussed a couple, but one that comes to mind a lot for me, especially when I used to work in retail, was this belief that refrigerated probiotics are always better. If it's in the fridge and it costs about 7 times more than what's on the shelf, it's probably going to be better. So let's talk about that and sort of break that down, and maybe where that idea came from as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the whole concept of probiotics needing to be in the fridge comes from historically the idea of when we used to associate probiotics with dairy products and fermented foods. And you know that the fridge is where you keep your yogurt and kefir, etc. And so that's where you keep your probiotics because after all, they're delicate live microorganisms and they need to be kept cold. Except that that's not quite true because modern probiotic supplements are no longer in yogurts and liquid things like that. They're kind of the opposite. They're freeze dried. And you know, when a bacterial cell is freeze dried, that essentially means that it has all of the intracellular moisture pulled out of it. It becomes, essentially dries out. And I often like to describe this state as kind of freeze drying is putting live bacteria into a very sleeping beauty like state. Exactly. So they're going to sleep. They're not dead. They're just deeply asleep, just like Sleeping Beauty. But while Sleeping Beauty was woken up by the kiss of a prince, hello, Sleeping Beauty, get with feminism. But probiotics are not woken up by kissing. They're woken up by exposure to moisture. Because if you think about the concept of, what's going on in your digestive tract, it's very wet in there. There's a lot of moisture. There's lots of mucus and secretions and liquids sloshing around. And this is where bacteria will kind of wake up and return to that state of active metabolism. So if we want to keep our probiotic products stable, it's no longer about keeping them cool. It's actually about keeping them dry. And that becomes far more important than keeping them cool. Temperature is far less important. If we think about, how much heat and for what period of time we need to kill bacteria. We don't sterilize anything by kind of, leaving it out in the kitchen for a day or so. Something would have, using heat to sterilize something, you would have to boil it for kind of 4 or 5 minutes at a time. And so your probiotic supplements are not going to die if they're not kept in the fridge. As long as they're kept dry, temperature actually isn't very relevant to their safety and viability.
Based on that point, Rebecca, in terms of those probiotics that come in glass jars, so we know there's brands that will have different powders in glass jars, which might not have any of that lipid coating. Could we say that, once these are exposed to moisture, because moisture is not just something they'll be exposed to in our digestive tract, could also be in our environment, correct? So is there a risk then with certain types of probiotics in these types of formulations, like in jars and things like that?
Yeah, definitely packaging plays a big role. And honestly, I'd be really hesitant about taking a probiotic that didn't come in individual blister packaging. Because like you just said, that kind of moisture, it doesn't have to be sopping wet for a dormant bacterial cell to return from dormancy to a state of active metabolism. Just moisture in the air will see a degradation in viability of a probiotic product. So if you're taking, probiotics out of a jar, every time you take the lid off, you're allowing environmental moisture to enter that jar, and this will see a degrading of the number of live bacterial units. So I'm a pretty big fan of making sure that probiotic products are individually packaged, like in a blister pack, or if you're looking at powder, individual stick packs, just to make sure that those bacteria are not coming into contact with environmental moisture or UV exposure or oxygen in the air until the point of time when they're actually being consumed.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think, you don't necessarily have to be in a humid environment or like North Queensland or Bali to be concerned about your probiotic, these formulations being exposed to moisture. I think it can happen a lot more easily maybe than most people think. And yeah, interesting you mentioned a lot of these companies will do like the amber glass or, try to use all these different tools to protect them from the UV light. But yeah, there's all these other questions that, can come up as to, the survival of some of these microorganisms.
Right.
Would you like to add anything to that, Mary? Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yes, I'm well aware of how we're going this time.
Yeah,
at the moment.
get all the questions out.
Yeah,
Questions.
I don't like it when she tries to school me.
Sorry.
when we're talking live. Anyway, so Rebecca, the next thing I'd love to ask is dosage of probiotics. So often you'll see these really interesting, like I'm not going to mention any brands here, right? But, 500 billion, 1,000 billion, 1 trillion probiotics in, live bacteria in this formulation. It's going to take you from 0 to 100. It's going to fix your whole life, essentially. So we see a lot of marketing around strength for probiotics. This is high strength, this is a super high amount, and then there'll be some sort of specific indications. Maybe some companies will ascribe to certain types of strength. So is there any legitimacy around some of these numbers that are sort of being thrown at us? Or again, does it come back to that strain or working at a particular strength that we've seen
like
in studies?
The more the better type mentality.
Yeah, that more the better.
Oh, this has 500 million, as you said, and this has 1,000 units. So which one am I going to take?
Yeah, and I think that whole concept comes back from types of medicine where dose is a lot more significant. So, we were talking before about how probiotics don't enter the bloodstream, they don't go through the liver, and this means they don't need to be in any way kind of metabolized by the liver. And when we have a substance which is going through the liver and in the bloodstream, then we may need a higher dose for someone who has a larger body or a more active liver, and we may need a lower dose for someone who's smaller or has a less mature liver, like a child. Probiotics don't work in that way because they're not being metabolized by the liver. And also because of their mode of action. A lot of medications and a lot of supplements and nutrients will work through their interaction with receptor sites throughout the whole body. And so therefore, a higher dose of a particular medicine or supplement means that more receptor sites are going to be interacted with, and you're going to have a more powerful response. Probiotics are not dose dependent in that way, that they're not going into the bloodstream, so we don't need a higher dose for a more powerful response. Where we know that efficacy is affected by probiotic supplements generally doesn't come from the number of bacteria we're taking, it comes from the strain specificity. And that's a term that we've used a few times in this conversation, and we should probably define it a little bit more. What do I mean when I use that term strain specific or strain specificity, apart from it just being a little bit of a tongue twister? It's actually a really, really important phrase. And what it's referring to is the exact genetic identity of a particular strain of probiotic. And if we just kind of go through what we mean by a strain, when you're looking at a bacterial name, every bacteria has 3 parts to its name. It has a genus, a species, and a strain. And a great example here, I'll just take one popular strain of probiotic, Lactobacillus plantarum 299V. It's a really well-known probiotic. It's used, by many, many people all around the world because it's a fantastic IBS strain. It's a fantastic strain for doing things like enhancing iron uptake, and it's a really well-regarded strain. So a lot of people will know the name Lactobacillus plantarum 299V. But if you're looking for a probiotic to help you absorb iron, you can't take just any probiotic. It must be that Lactobacillus plantarum 299V. It can't even be another species of plantarum. You need to have that 299V bit on the end. So if we kind of, make up a little analogy to make it make sense, and this is something that I find works really well with people who are new to the world of probiotics. If we say that the whole kind of nomenclature of probiotics can be analogous to thinking about the primary school that your kids go to or that you went to, and if we imagine that imagine the school local to you, and all of the kids go to that school. They go to the school of lactobacillus. So you imagine that school with a big kind of, archway saying lactobacillus, and all of the kids filing into that school are going into the school of lactobacillus. And that's the genus of bacteria. In Australia, most of the probiotics we use come from one of two genera. They come from either the genus of lactobacillus or the genus of bifidobacteria. And there are some others as well, but they're the two most common. So if we imagine in a little town in Australia, we've got two primary schools, the school of lactobacillus and the school of bifidobacteria. And all of the kids who go to the lactobacillus school, they're all in the same school, but they still go to their individual classrooms. So in that school of lactobacillus, one of the classrooms is the plantarum classroom. Another classroom might be the acidophilus classroom. Another classroom might be the rhamnosus classroom. And these are all classes in the school of lactobacillus. Now, in that plantarum class, we have a bunch of kids who all get along really well, who have a lot in common, who have similar interests, but who still have their own special talents. So we might have the kid who's good at soccer, the kid who's good at poetry, the kid who's a science whiz, and they're all in that same class, but they've still got their special interests. And that's what our strains are. So in that classroom of plantarum, we've got 30 or 40 strains in that plantarum species, but they're individual strains, just as we have individual students in a classroom. So we've got 299V, which is great for IBS and absorbing iron. We've got 6595, which helps to activate tight junctions between enterocytes and also produces specific bacteriocins against things like E. coli and Shigella. We've got Heal 9, which has been shown to reduce the risk of respiratory infections. We've got LP01, which is an anti-constipation strain. So these are all strains of Lactobacillus plantarum, but they all have their own special talents. And we need to know which strain we want to give our patient, or which strain we as a consumer want to take, based on what the research tells us that strain has been shown to do, and in what dose as well that strain has been shown to do. So there's no point in taking 500 billion of a particular strain if it's not going to perform the mechanism that leads to the outcome you want to see. Now, dose becomes far of less importance than strain specificity.
That was such a fantastic explanation, Rebecca. And I think it just reconsolidates that whole understanding around probiotics from food and fermented foods versus probiotics in supplements, and really gives listeners a good idea of what to look out for, and empowering them to actually have a look at some of these labels and packaging to understand, well, is this product actually going to be worth it? What kind of research is there available on some of these claims? Because you will find that there's claims on a lot of probiotic products as well. Hay fever probiotic, for example. Like, I'm just thinking in terms of what's on the shelf in a lot of retail pharmacies and health food stores. So it gives people that confidence to sort of say, okay, look, this is the claim that they're making. Let me have a look at the back and see what strain is in there. And it doesn't really take much to sometimes just, pop onto Google and look into that strain and see if there is actually any evidence, or if anyone that's listening has some sort of a health background, looking up that strain, say in some sort of database to understand what data does exist. But you've mentioned some really great strains that do lots of wonderful different things. I'm curious, since we've been talking about different strains, and I know we don't have heaps of time left, but I did have some listeners on our podcast page that were interested in probiotics and allergies. So I wanted to explore, I use probiotics heaps in my practice for allergies, but, I know there's one particular strain which is amazing in this area. So if we could talk just a little bit about that, that would be amazing.
Of course. And that's actually one of my favorite strains, because, yes, I do like to rank my favorite strains, because I'm just such an interesting person. I have so much in my life. So one of my favorite probiotic strains is Lactobacillus salivarius LS01. And this particular strain is always what I would reach for in allergic or atopic conditions. And that's because this strain has been shown to do a couple of really interesting things in the context of those conditions. So it's been shown to, on an immunological level, help to normalize the ratio of Th1 lymphocytes compared to Th2 lymphocytes. And these are different kind of classes of lymphocytes which produce different groups of cytokines from their cell membrane. When we have someone who is very prone to allergic type conditions like hay fever, like eczema, like asthma as well, then very often what we see is that these people are more likely to present with what we call a Th2 phenotype. So they're more likely, if you were to take a blood sample and have a look at the type of white blood cells that they present, they're more likely to be essentially overproducing the Th2 type of lymphocyte in comparison to Th1 type. And these, like I said before, these are lymphocytes which produce different cytokines or chemical messengers, immune system chemicals from their cell membranes. And when we have someone who is essentially overproducing these Th2 lymphocytes, it means that they're more likely to be producing particular immune chemicals which make them more responsive to external allergens. So their immune system is going to be more likely to mount an attack to an otherwise harmless substance. These people are going to be more likely for their immune systems to see, for example, pollen as an invading pathogen and that needs to have an immune response mounted to it. So they're going to be more likely to experience hay fever. They're going to be more likely to react to food proteins and environmental proteins in the form of itchy skin like eczema. They're going to be more likely for their respiratory systems to react to airborne allergens and, present with the symptoms of asthma. So getting back to this probiotic strain Salivarius LS01, what this strain has been shown to do is modulate those immune cells so that we are now producing a more optimal ratio of those Th1 and Th2 lymphocytes, essentially meaning that the immune system is going to be a bit less reactive and less likely to go straight into that allergic type histamine release and presentation of itchy skin and respiratory distress. So over time, taking a probiotic containing Lactobacillus salivarius LS01 can help to make someone less responsive to those allergenic proteins out there.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing strain, and I
see why you love it.
Yeah, and it works really well, really well in clinical practice. It's probably one of my most prescribed strains of probiotics. So I'm a huge fan. I love LS01 as well. We're good mates. Thank you so much for taking us and our listeners through the huge world of probiotics and helping to define, what they are, what to sort of look out for, and just really empower everyone with information that's going to help them to make better informed choices when it comes to probiotics, and even just buying supplements in general. I think, being more empowered as consumers to know what to look out for. And, I think we're both just as passionate about, evidence-based practice and, quality, looking at, quality products that are also, TGA listed or
what they claim.
Exactly.
And hopefully we get to see people move away from just like this generalized concept of taking something for a wellness and strain specificity. I think if any of the listeners, if you just take away one thing out of this podcast today, it'd be the strain specificity. Yeah,
it's a bit of a touch.
That's where you're going to get the most benefit, and that's where you're actually going to help yourself. Yeah.
And I think just to clarify for any of our listeners, I think it's been made clear as well in terms of the difference, but maybe that could be our last question just to clarify before we wrap up. In terms of the difference between prebiotics and probiotics, we've discussed so far that probiotics, have a specific purpose, and we're sort of, looking at research where they've got a specific outcome, and we're looking to research and understand that outcome. Whereas, just to clarify for prebiotics, for our listeners that don't know, and Rebecca, you can touch on this, but this is more about feeding the bacteria that's already in our microbiome. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So the term prebiotic refers to a substance on which bacteria can ferment. So essentially they're substrates or fuel sources. And lots of different things have prebiotic activity. Any fiber you eat, so any kind of plant food will contain prebiotics. There are specific prebiotics which have been shown to preferentially provide fuel for particular groups of microbes in your microbiome. But I feel like that's probably a discussion in its own right for another day.
Yeah, I think so. Probably opened a bit of a can of worms there. There you go. Everyone can research that in their own time if they like as well. But thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. We are so grateful for your time, your expertise, your knowledge. Obviously, I'm your biggest fan. I know you're my biggest fan as well. So
look, there was two lecturers that stood out of my whole experience, and one of them is always you. The other one was Tanya Wells. So they're the two where I just thought, oh my God, these women are powerhouses, and they're just like, the mega mind. I just that's what I picture with you guys, mega mind. But yeah, definitely left a mark on my university experience where I was looking up to these two women, and I was just like, wow, wealth of information. Yeah,
two icons.
Definitely.
Yeah, but Rebecca likes me more than you, just letting you know.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You're more likable. It's okay.
I'm not getting involved in this conversation.
I'm happy to accept that. I'm not going to fight it.
So much love, Rebecca. Do you have any last sentiments you'd like to share with our listeners, or any recommendations on where people can go to sort of find out more information about probiotics? I know the Activated Probiotic website is incredible for anyone who's looking for information there, and also I love that you guys do list the research and have links to like studies and things like that for different strains, which is awesome. But is there anywhere that you recommend as well?
Yeah, so have a look at the website, but also if you're into social media, follow our Instagram. There's lots of really fun little things shared there all the time, little videos and snippets of studies. And I know that our wonderful marketing team has some cool Instagram plans ahead. So follow us on Instagram. But in terms of last messages about your microbiome, look after it. Feed it. What your microbiome loves more than anything is diversity. Eat as diverse a range of foods as you possibly can. Set yourself a little challenge to see how many different types of plant food you can take in a week, because every different type of plant food you eat is feeding diversity of your microbiome, and diversity is what's most associated with positive health outcomes. So eat with your microbiome in mind would be my best advice there.
Sorry, you just froze in that last part, but we heard that you said to have as much diversity as possible.
Yes,
you froze
yes,
up.
Absolutely. Feed your microbiome as many different types of plant food as you possibly can.
Yeah. And for any carnivore fanatics that are listening, please take our advice on this one, because there's a lot of research to show that plant foods is the way. Thank you so much. And just before I forget to mention, Activated Probiotic products for the most part are practitioner only, so you can get them from chemists, some health food stores. Am I correct, Rebecca? So they are stocked at a few places, but you can also get them through practitioners like myself and Miriam. So hit us up if you're interested in exploring the use of some of these probiotics. But I believe you can get them through some retail spheres as well, like Terry White and things like that.
Particular community pharmacies who have a service focus and who have pharmacists who are passionate about evidence-based probiotics. You can get them from those particular practitioners over the counter.
Amazing. Good stuff.
Yeah, we really appreciate this, Rebecca. Thank you for taking the time out for us.
It's always lovely to see former students doing well out there in the world. Congratulations on everything that you're achieving.
We love you so much. All right, before I start crying, we'll just wrap it all up. And thank you so much for joining us. Let me, Miriam can add a cute finish. Let me stop recording though. There we go.